Good morning, everyone. Good morning. That's more like the energy. I'm used to it. Okay. It is my pleasure, my joy to be here and to be speaking with Bernadine Evaristo this morning. My name is Angela Wachuka, as you've heard, and I'm looking forward to a discussion that delves into many, many things about the life of this wonderful writer with us here today. And we will jump right in. Bernardine, I know that you're here with your nephew, and I know that we've talked, Lola has talked a little bit about you having been to Nigeria before and your Nigeria heritage. You, in terms of the structure of your memoir, manifesto on never giving up, I noticed that in every chapter, you've got it in English, you've got it in how many different languages?
I think it's 5.
5, and one of which is Yoruba. In this manifesto, you talk about becoming an overnight success after 40 years of hard work. This memoir, I think you published 2 years after your Booker Prize in 2019, so we're talking about 2021. What was important about publishing it at that time, after such a huge win in your life?
Yes. Well, hello, everybody. Thanks for coming out. And thanks to Lola for re-inviting me to this incredible festival. I've been to many, many festivals all over the world, and I have to say, this is one of the best, as is Angela's festival in Kenya. And the vibe of these festivals is so different to the vibe of, you can imagine, British festivals. So, and the style as well is through the roof. So it's great to be here, and thank you. Yes, so Manifesto was published 2 years after I won the Booker Prize, and I just wanted to tell people in my own words where I'd come from and how I'd reached this point. And it is a memoir, it's not an autobiography, in the sense that it's not the entire story of my life. I'm looking at different aspects of my life in order to understand where my creativity comes from, and my career, how my career developed over the decades. Because winning the Booker Prize after 40 years in the arts is an amazing thing to happen. It completely revolutionized my career. I'd always wanted a big audience for my work, and I never had it until I won the Booker. And then suddenly, everybody knew me, you know, and I loved it, right? I'm not going to say that it was a difficult moment for me, because some people say, oh, I won the Booker Prize, it was terrible. You know, everybody was stopping me in the street, you know. And I actually really enjoyed it, and I really do enjoy it, because... you know, writers were not really supposed to say that, because I had been in the game for so long, and I wanted to reach as many people as possible, because when you spend many years writing a book, you want people to read it. And I think Girl, Woman, Others sold like 1.5 million now, and that's just in the English language. So, and you compare that to my other books, where the biggest sale I had was a book called Hello Mum, which was sold very cheaply, and it sold 70,000, which is a lot, but it was a very cheap book. It was called a Quick Reads. It was for people who aren't used to reading. But otherwise, my book sold a few thousand. So to go from a few thousand to 1.5 plus million and all the other things that came with my career was an incredible thing. And so I felt there aren't many literary memoirs told from the perspective of Black women, right? Lola, I'm expecting to read yours at some point. Are you writing it? Yes, because I don't know. We're just not there really in the literature world. Enough of us for publishers to want to publish a memoir. So it was really important to me to tell my own story in my own words. Which when you do reach a level of success, you find people put words in your mouth that you haven't said, and it's annoying. So here I was, having gone through this incredible sort of revolutionary moment for my career, and then I thought, okay, I'm going to tell my own story in my own words, but it's going to be kind of focused on my creativity.
Thank you for that. We're going to go back, speaking of your own story in your own words, we're going to go back to the beginning. When I was reading this book, I was really fascinated, Bernadine, by your family history. And on both ends, we begin. How many people have read this memoir yet? Okay, show of hands. We have a fair amount, and we're hoping for more. Yes, Amin, I see you. Amin has read it.
She
will be on
interviewed me
Instagram
yesterday.
soon. So we begin the story kind of with your father, who is Nigerian, who's from this country, goes to the UK. I think it's 1949 when he arrives. You talk about him meeting your mother. Your father's story is very fascinating. His training to be a welder, I believe. And then his own father had come back to Nigeria from Brazil after the abolishment of slavery, I think in 1888. So you've got your father then coming to the UK. Your mother is from there. Her parents are, I think, a milkman, your grandfather was. And your grandmother is a seamstress, dressmaker. And your parents then meet at a Commonwealth dance, right? And then 10 years later, you happen. Could you talk to us a little bit about your origin and what your family setup was like, and having your siblings and growing up in Britain at that time?
Yes, so my father arrived in 1949, and, you know, the black history of Britain goes back at least 2,000 years. So just to make that point. But in the 20th century, there was a big migration of Africans to Britain, and people from the Caribbean to Britain, and people from Asia to Britain. But my father was part of that very earlier generation of people who came after the Second World War, because a lot of British men had been killed in the war and they needed to replenish the workforce. And this is something I talk about in my book, Lara. So he arrives in Britain. He left from a Papadox. His father had died before he was born. So he left his mother, and actually I discovered many years later when I came here that he didn't say goodbye to her. He just left. And I imagine that's because he didn't want her to stop him. His twin sister had died before he left. So he arrives in Britain at a time when racism was very legal. It wasn't going to be illegal until nearly 30 years later. It was very hostile. The British public had been raised on a diet of colonial bigotry about Africa, about all the countries in its colonies. This notion of Britain as a superior nation and all the other colonies being full of savages, Africa in particular, who needed to be Christianized and educated. And actually, slavery, believe it or not, was part of that education, taking them from barbarity to civilization for hundreds of years of slavery in the New World. Anyway, that's not quite what I'm writing about in the book. But so I just like to give you the context. So he came into a country where people saw him as a savage, an uncivilized savage. And it was very, very difficult for his generation. And he found work as a welder. And he met my mother, who was this Catholic girl who was at a convent teachers training college. They fell in love. Her family went ballistic because they and I also write about this, Lara, but they were basically a working class family who were aspirational to become middle class, and every generation would move further up the class ladder. And so what my mother did was, she was being educated, she was at college training to be a teacher. That was very aspirational for my family, her side of the family. And then she says she's dating a black man. She comes home from a dance and says she's dating a black man, and all hell kicked off. And then she said she was going to marry him. And that was just, my grandmother just went ballistic. And they tried everything in their power to stop my mother marrying my father. But she was a good Christian, right? They were Catholics. She was a good Christian. And she decided she loved him, and that was it. So they got married, and she had 8 children in 10 years. And so she wasn't teaching because she was raising all these children. And then my father was working in a factory as a welder, and we were raised in a place called Woolwich. Does anybody here know Woolwich? So you might know Woolwich as a really kind of multicultural area, lots of Nigerians, but no, it wasn't then. You're talking about the 50s and 60s, even the 70s. It was a very white area. And so there was a lot of racism. We had political organisation called the National Front, they were basically beating black people up on the streets, Asian people up on the streets and so on. So they had all these children in a very white area. And we were kind of like the bogey family in the street because we were black, because there were so many of us. And the house was a very rundown house. And yeah, so that's part of the origin story that I talk about in here.
Thank you. We then, before you kind of move out of home, we learn about the kind of dynamics within your home, also what's happening in that area that you're growing up. I wonder if you could read for us a little bit, please, this would be page 22 of the book, if you have a copy, where we get a sense of what Bernadine's home environment is like and your relationship with your parents.
Yes. So for those of you here who saw me read yesterday, it's the same section. And it's just coincidence that you've both chosen the same section.
Great minds.
Yes, great minds. I was a tomboy, squashed between two brothers who let me play with them until they didn't, bonding with each other more than they could bond with the girl in the equation. I'm the fourth in the family, and we middle children tend to be very independent for obvious reasons. You just get on with it. I've always felt myself to have an inner strength, by which I mean that I'm not needy or clingy. I don't crave approval all the time, and I'm happy with my own company. In terms of the span of my life and my career, a tough inner core has been essential to my creative survival. This hardiness was probably first developed in my early years. I've never been in therapy, as I like to live with my demons. By this, I don't mean that I'm living with unresolved trauma, but that I've become adept at self-interrogation and have never felt driven to seek help. I like to work things out for myself, and I guess this book is a massive act of self-interrogation. My unaffectionate father demanded a goodnight kiss from his children, an obligatory sign of devotion. "Good night, Daddy," we had to say. It was the last thing I wanted to do before I went to bed, or at any time, but you get into trouble if you didn't go downstairs to the kitchen, where he'd be sitting reading a paper or listening to the radio and go through the ritual. I was never treated as an individual by my father, and I can't recall any conversations with him that weren't lectures. His children were lumped together as a single entity. He never once said so much as "How was your day, Bolaji?" My Yoruba name is Mobolaji. My parents gave their children both English and Yoruba names. You don't develop a personal relationship with your child if you can't even pass the time of day with them. Conversely, my mother wanted us all to be individuals rather than conformists. She had seen how her mother's life had been blighted by worrying about what the neighbours thought of her, living in suburbia alongside the curtain twitchers, locked into their conventional outlooks and striving to keep up appearances with their ideal homes and manicured gardens. Do you want me to end there?
Thank you. Buy a copy for more. So we then move in the memoir into you being a young woman. You move out of home at 18, which is fairly early. Is it?
Not so much then, actually.
Not so much then, okay. And then we go into a segment where you're starting to write poetry, you're developing your voice, you go off to college. One of the things that I found fascinating and quite formidable, I think for you at the time, was the people whose company you kept at college. The fact that there were, I think, a total of 5 black girls with you, and how important that period becomes for you in terms of shaping your voice and all the work that you produce and publish later. Could you talk to us about that time and being a young woman of learning drama and what that period was like for you and how it shapes you later?
So, as I said, Woolwich was a very white area when I was growing up. And so I didn't know many black people. I had 3 sisters and 4 brothers, but we didn't know a lot of black people. And then I went to Rose Bruford College of Speech and Drama to train to be an actor. And there were 5 black women in my year, which was very unusual for a drama school at that time, because drama schools didn't like to accept more than 1 black person per year, because they said, well, there's no work for you, so there's no point in training you, right? That's changed a lot since then, but it's pretty dire. So there were 5 of us in our year, and of course we got together. And we were also in a drama school where we were trained to create our own theatre. And so we started to put on plays from our experiences. And we put on a play about 5 black women called Coping, which we then toured outside of the college to various venues. And we realised that there was a demand for this, that actually there was no black women's theatre in Britain. And it was very hard to find employment as a black female actor, let alone a black actor. It was very hard. Any actor of colour, it was very hard to find work because it was a very different culture at that time. And so what we did was we formed a theatre company when we left called Theatre of Black Women, 3 of us, myself, Paulette Randall, who's still a huge theatre director in the UK, and Patricia St. Hilaire, who left theatre eventually. And we started to put on plays by black women, initially ourselves, to act in them initially ourselves, and to tour the country. And the company ran for 6 years. And it was part of the reason we formed the company was because there was no work for us. And we decided, well, if there's no work for us, we need to create it for ourselves. And that was very formative for me at that time, because even as a writer, I would say that's what I'm doing. I'm writing into the absences and the silences that exist. Because rather than accept that we are not present, that we are not in the literature, although it's changed quite a lot recently, that we should just accept this kind of marginalised, almost invisible status, do something about it, create your own work. And that's what we did with Theatre of Black Women.
And you go on to do a lot of that, Bernadine. One of the things I've really enjoyed about looking at your life story is how at different stages of your writing, of your career, you end up, when you go into places, leaving the door open for other people to come through. But you're still a young woman. I've really enjoyed kind of reading your story about being in your 20s and 30s and finding yourself and all the hilarious things that happen to you as you're navigating being a young woman in London. Could you tell us about some of the formidable experiences that you had around relationships and how that shaped your writing later?
Yeah, I mean, this book is it's about my life. One of the chapters is about relationships, because I think creative people often don't focus on relationships in terms of how they shape who we become and how we live our lives. And I'm married now. I married my husband. We've been together 20 years. But I had a very lively life as a young person. And I had relationships with men and women in my 20s. I had relationships with women. I was very feminist. I was very much felt like an outsider. And I found a community that was a creative community that was very supportive of me and my life. And in the book, I talk about how these relationships affected me and how I was in one relationship for 5 years that was so toxic, I would have stopped writing if I had stayed in that relationship, because that person, while they were my biggest supporter at the beginning, later became somebody who tried to stop me writing. You know, as a writer, and I know there's a lot of young writers here, it's really important that you find the strength within to do what you want to do as a writer and a creative person. And while external affirmation and validation is fantastic, if that goes, you can be left completely kind of vulnerable because you haven't built up that inner self where you have to believe in it yourself first and foremost. So that relationship was the worst end of the spectrum. But I also talk about how those relationships help me understand who we are as human beings. And as a writer, we need to understand who we are as human beings, a fiction writer. So, human psychology is very interesting to me. And being in intimate relationships, as I was, kind of across the spectrum, was a real learning curve, although I didn't realize it at the time, because an intimate relationship with somebody can be very informative about human behavior. You're seeing behind the facade, you're understanding who people really are, as opposed to the sort of, the surface image that they're presenting. And even the sort of the painful relationships, and I had, several painful relationships. I mean, this book goes into them, but it's quite a light touch. I don't kind of go into a great deal of depth, but even the painful relationships help me connect to who I am and what I want, and all of that helped me become a writer. So one of the things people say about me, they say, you write all these different characters. How do you do that? And you really, the characters feel very alive, and they kind of, they pop off the page and so on. And I would say that part of the reason for that is because I did a lot of emotional work on myself through my relationships, and also was able to understand a lot of people on a very intimate level, which then fed into how I write characters.
Great, and I think that's a great segue, Bernadine, into a section in the book on page 67 that I'd like you to read, please, to just share that segment about deeper feelings and how that has helped to shape the characters you then create, and even the form that you then start to develop that's quite unique, which we'll talk about in a bit.
My deeper feelings were first stirred through my attractions to other people. Before then, I think I surfed over my emotions, and I did not know how profoundly I could feel, or at least be conscious of it, until I fell in love. If the love was long distance or unrequited, then I further plummeted into the subterranean depths of longing. This passion, this state of hypersensitive innovation, became a driver for my writing, in that I never wanted to be the kind of cerebral writer whose work was intellectually fertile but emotionally arid. I wanted to be the kind of writer who can reach people at a deeper level, the power to touch, to move, and I was never more emotional than when I was in a relationship or wanting to be in one. Just to say, to add to that, because I began writing poetry, and poetry is often, one of the ways in which we express ourselves emotionally. That was also how I began expressing my emotions through my writing before I started writing novels and fiction, where all the emotional landscape was then presented through the characters.
Thank you for sharing that. And I think especially for people who are in the room, who've been writing for a long time and who are looking at different forms, or maybe questioning if the format that they're following is the one for them. One of the really humanizing things about learning about your process, Bernardine, was even learning about how many thousands of words sometimes you would write and then dump, because you realize at some point that the format maybe wasn't working for you, that perhaps you weren't capturing the sort of emotions and giving the fullness of character that you wanted to. And I want to talk a bit about how this form has changed for you over the years. I think we start off with your first publication, 1994, was it? And by the time we get to your 8th book in 2019, Girl, Woman, Other, where you've talked about what you call polyvocal structures throughout this time, from 1994 with Island of Abraham, 1997 with Lara, then the book that you just talked about, the short.
I talked about Lara.
You talked about Lara.
Yes, then it was The Emperor's Babe.
Then The Empress Babe. Then we have Soul Tourist. Then we have Blonde Roots.
Hello, Mum.
Hello, Mum.
Mr. Loverman.
Mr. Loverman. And then Girl, Woman, Other. And then Manifesto. So we're talking about such a full body of work, right? And of course, by the time we arrive at Girl, Woman, Other, which I think a lot of people then would know you for, it's been decades and decades and decades of experimenting with all these forms, Could you talk to us about that progression and how you find yourself in this multiplicity of representation when it comes to your characters and how they speak and how you write about them?
Yes, yes. So I began writing poetry for theatre, verse drama, and then I left theatre behind and I just wrote poetry. And then I started to write verse novels. And that all looks it's an unusual journey, I think, for most writers, but it was a slow progress for me from like around 1980 to my first sort of as straightforward as possible prose fiction was Blonde Roots, and that was published in 2005. So it was a process of about 25 years where I was moving towards writing a slightly more traditional novel. But my process was always, as a poet, for those of you who are poets in the audience, my process is always about rewriting. Poets do that all the time. They might rewrite a poem 100 times. And I was somebody who was really interested in language because of my poetry background. So I was crafting my language, which meant that my process was quite slow because the use of language was as important to me as the telling of the story. But I was always wanting to write a more traditional prose novel because I saw the novel as a very expansive form where you could just put so much into it. And so with my book, Lara, which was published in 1997, I spent 3 years working on it as a prose novel until I realised it really didn't work. I literally threw the manuscript in the bin, never to be seen again. In those days, it wasn't so easy to keep things on folders. And I then turned it into a verse novel, and that took 2 years. With my book, Soul Tourist, I spent a couple of years working on it as a prose novel, and then turned it into a novel with verse. So it was prose and poetry side by side. Before I wrote Mr. Loverman, I was working on a book about a Gambian man who sails to Britain in the late 19th century, and he's a sailor, and he eventually settles in Cornwall and works down a tin mine. I spent 3 years on that, produced God knows how many thousands of words, and I realised it wasn't working. I didn't throw that away. The original is there somewhere. But it was about 40,000 words that I turned into a 6,000 word short story. In the end, that's all I salvaged from it. And then wrote Mr. Loverman. And as soon as I started writing Mr. Loverman, I thought, this is it. This is the book I should have been writing. It just felt like it was meant to be. So the process has been one of trial and error, trial and error, trial and error. Sometimes a book might begin as a few poems, like The Emperor's Babe, and then I turn it into a whole verse novel, but that was never the intention. Girl, Woman, Other is what I call a fusion fiction, in that some people think it's poetry, but I think it's a mix of both. And the form, which doesn't use much punctuation, has what I call a pro-poetic patterning on the page, allows me to tell the story of 12 different characters. 11 of them are women, one is non-binary, and their lives flow into each other as the lines flow into each other on the page. And it's a form that allowed me to tell that very polyphonic story. But in Lara, which is the book about my family history, I'd also told a polyphonic story about all the different ancestors in my family, including my childhood, my parents, going back on my mother's side to German and Irish ancestry, on my father's side to Nigerian, Brazilian, and to tell this story about a multicultural British family through bringing alive all the ancestors. And that, again, was made possible through the poetic form. So I teach creative writing at Brunel University of London, and some of the students come into the class and they've written a short story an hour before on their phones. And then when I give them critique, and you're not really allowed to say throw it away these days, unfortunately, but when I give them critique, they're really offended. And I have to tell them, do you know how many years I've worked on something and I've had to throw it away because it wasn't working? Because I don't think a lot of writers do it my way. I think some writers are very straightforward. They spend 6 months, a year, 2 years, 3 years on a book, it's done. Whereas my route has been just so complicated But it is always about the work being the best that it can be. And I have a brilliant editor, Simon Prosser at Hamish Hamilton, which is part of Penguin Random House. I've been working with him since 1999. He never accepts anything but the best for me. So even when I think a manuscript is finished, like if some of you I know will probably have read Mr. Loverman, it was only Barrington's story. I sent it to my editor and I'm like, here it is, it's done. And he said, what about the wife? Because Barrington has a wife and he's in a very negative relationship with her. They've been together 50 years. And he said, I think we need to hear the wife's story. And so then I went away and I thought, how are we going to hear Carmel's story when Barrington is the narrator? Because we're only seeing the story through his eyes. And then I thought, okay, I give Carmel her own sections. And that's what makes the book. Barrington's side of the story and Carmel's side by side.
I'm going to stick a little bit with this idea of experimenting with form and coming back to this wonderful theme at Ake about reclaiming truths and how the forms that you've played with sort of help you reclaim truths that perhaps a kind of more traditional structure doesn't, or perhaps wouldn't, I'm not sure. But also the purpose of writing some of this work and especially looking at the audience and the fact that we have so many young people in the room who may themselves be writing. I'm compelled to have you read us a segment again from why you were writing, and I think this is a reflection on Lara, on why you were writing Lara and the connection with your family story. And the reason why I'm doing that is that once you're done with that, I'd like us to speak a little bit about sticking to the art of writing, even when it's not perhaps financially viable for people who are writing today. It's on page 129.
Lara is my version of my family origin story. One of migration and immigration, longing and belonging, family and love across the divides, and struggle, ambition, and resilience in the face of bigotry, poverty, and adversity. The struggle to fit in, to be accepted in your new country and find your way through it, has been the migrant experience since time immemorial, along with negative stereotyping. Lara is my tribute, not only to my family history, but to multicultural Britain and to the everlasting global reality of cross-pollination as an essential, life-enhancing force within all of us.
So you write Lara, and some books, until 2019, the kind of commercial breakthrough for you hasn't happened in the same way that Girl, Woman, Other brought to your world. Could you speak to the audience about maybe one thing about the value of books that don't break through commercially, and what kept you going, what kept you writing, and what would you tell a young writer who may find themselves in that position today?
Books are here forever now. Years ago, if you published a book and it didn't sell well, the publisher will stop printing it, the bookshops wouldn't stock it, even though one copy of every book is lodged in the British Library and has been for hundreds of years. It has to be by law lodged there. The books disappeared, and that was terrible. So people they wouldn't understand the industry. They'd be very excited. They've got a book that's going to be published, and then sometimes their books wouldn't make it to the bookshops because the bookshops wouldn't accept, because they'd think we're not going to be able to sell this book, so we're not going to try and sell it. And then even if they did sell it, as in put it in the bookshops, if it didn't sell enough, they would take it off the shelves. So the books would disappear. Now we're living in a very different world. We're living in a digital world, right? So books are available forever. So my books didn't sell when they were published in big numbers. But because I won the Booker Prize, it's my back catalogue, right? So now they're coming through and people are buying them and they're being translated into languages in a way that they weren't before. So basically, it's not over till it's over. But the reason to write a book is obviously you want to reach a market. But more than that, it has to be because it's something deep inside you. There's a story you want to tell, one that hasn't been told before. Even if it's been told, it hasn't been told in the way that you're going to tell it. It's your connection to your creativity, which is the most important thing. And then you put it out into the world and you try as hard as you can to get the book out there. One of the things I learned from my theatre days in the 80s was marketing, was the fact that we had this theatre company, we had to market it. In those days, we had leaflets. Does anybody here remember leaflets? Leaflets, right? Those pieces of paper that you'd have to hand out and leave in venues so that people would come across it. It was really hard, compared to today, right? So, but I learned the value of marketing. It was my company with 2 other women, and we had to let everybody know what we were doing and push our work. So when I started publishing my books, first of all with 2 very small publishers, I was marketing my work as I did with the theatre company. I did not think, okay, these books are published and that's it. Something amazing has to happen, and if it doesn't, I'm going to kill myself, right? I'd take my books everywhere. I put my books into the hands of people who were literary editors, who were editors at publishing houses, who were writing book reviews. I wrote thousands of letters all over the world, sometimes sending the book itself to people saying, I'm available for readings, to appear at festivals. I did not wait for them to come to me. So I was doing the hustle. In every way possible with my own money, because my publishers were small, they didn't have the resources. I was doing the hustle. Until when I won the Booker, I didn't have to do the hustle anymore. But I still do, in a way, because that's in me. So, for example, I wanted to tour with the British Council. I know there's somebody here from the British Council. And I had seen all these writers I don't think they do it so much anymore, but there was a long period when a lot of writers were being sent all over the world with the British Council. And I was like, oh, I want to do that. And so instead of waiting for them to find me, which probably would have never happened, I wrote to the director of literature, who's called Alistair Niven, who unfortunately died this year. And I said, I would really like to tour with the British Council. And I sent him a copy of my book. And he very kindly gave me a meeting. And then the first gig they sent me to was in Ghana in 1997. Yes. And I never stopped. I didn't stop touring for them for about 20 years, because when I went, I made sure everything worked well, even though it was sometimes difficult to do that, right? Because obviously you're going to different countries and so on. But that was me doing the hustle. And then friends of mine would say to me, well, how come you get sent to the British Council? I said, well, I went to them. They said, really? You can do that? I mean, yes. It's like we're so kind of self-defeating, really. Too afraid to ask. Too afraid to put ourselves out there. Too afraid to see what the opportunities are, and then make sure those people who are able to give us those opportunities know who we are. But also understanding that we are all part of an ecosystem, and it's not just taking, it's also giving. Right? So you have to keep the energy flowing so that you're not just greedy and taking things and holding it to yourself, but that which is what this festival is doing. It's sharing, right? So these are just, this, obviously, people are here, some people are from the UK, some people are not. You know how this might apply in your situation. Now you have email, right? You have email. It's so easy. Even though you might send out 100 emails to people saying, hey, this is who I am, this is my work, I'd love to appear at your festival in the UK, why not? You do a nice little website for yourself, you present yourself with a bio and the rest of it, so that you're marketing yourself. Even though you send 100 out and 95 people don't respond, there might be 5 responses, which is more than you would have got. Sorry, I'm just going to say one more thing. I remember I used to get inspiration from all the art forms years ago, and I used to read other people's tips for how they became successful. And Nicole Kidman is a global superstar, and she was a global superstar, and she wanted this part. And what she did was she went into a studio, she wasn't going to get the part. She went into the studio dressed as the character, learnt some lines and sent it to the studios and said, I know I'm not being considered for this, but I want you to consider me for it. And this was about 20-something years ago. She was already a global superstar. I remember thinking, wow, that's Nicole Kidman, who is still doing The Hustle, right? And she got the part, and she was a huge hit in it.
I love that. I love that. So shout out to the bookstagrammers and book talkers. Keep doing your thing. Yeah? Imposter syndrome, no more. Yes, you're really appreciated. And as you can see from Bernadine's story, I think we begin with you not seeing a kind of perspective that you thought was important, Black British woman perspective in publishing in novels. And by the time we get to Girl, Woman, Other, you're telling a 100-year story with 12 perspectives of Black Britain, which is wonderful. There's something that you mentioned about giving back that I just want to close on before opening up the stage for our Q&A. One of the things I've enjoyed about watching you, Bernardine, as I said earlier, is the spaces that you open up. You teach, of course, like you said, at Brunel. You've got the Evaristo Prize for African Poetry for all the poets in the house. This is something to look up if you're not familiar with it. It's a great prize that started off at Brunel University that's now named in your honor. There's the great work that you've done as president of the Royal African Society.
Royal Society of
Royal
Literature.
Society of Literature, sorry. Royal Society of Literature. And then recently, the Pioneer Prize for Women over 60. Could you talk to us about that and why it was important for you to support that?
Just to talk about the sharing as well. So my dad came to Britain in 1969, and maybe 25 years later, he was a socialist activist, and he became a local Labour councillor in Greenwich, where we lived, and he was holding surgeries every Saturday, helping people in the local community with various issues to do with their health and council and so on. He took us on marches. He himself was a big marcher. He was a shop steward in the factory where he worked. So that was the culture I grew up in, right? This man who had been an immigrant, who had been completely on the outside, then really helping people in the community, and most of the community were white working class at that stage. It became a bit blacker later, but so I grew up with this sense, even though you're not even thinking of it, that life is not just about you. It's about how you operate in the world, how you share, how you open doors. Yesterday I mentioned the concept of Ubuntu, which I think people know, my life in your life. It's really, really important. So the various schemes I've done in my life have sort of run along side by side with my creativity, which is the most important thing. My career is number one, right? But then I have time, right? I have time to do other things. And so I've come up with various initiatives. And the Pioneer Prize, it's called the RSL, which stands for the Royal Society of Literature. The reason I gave them that prize was because they've been around 200 years, and they're going to be around another 200 years, right? And a lot of organizations don't last very long. So I thought I'd call it the RSL Pioneer Prize. And it's a prize for women over 60 who have made an outstanding contribution to literature over the course of their career and maybe haven't been acknowledged for it. I won a prize myself this year called the Women's Prize Outstanding Contribution Award, which came with an amount of money. And I thought I would put that money into this prize so that over 10 years, a different writer is given this prize as an acknowledgement, an affirmation of their contribution to literature. I chose the first winner, but I won't choose any of the others. There will be a jury every year who will convene, who will decide who that person is, and every year it will be a different genre. So it'll be a playwright, a poet, a non-fiction writer, and so on. So that was, I feel that I've had incredible blessings the last 6 years, incredible. And I feel better about it if I share some of it, basically.
Wonderful. And thank you. Thank you, Bernadine, for sharing. And I want to share the mic with all of you. I see hands. Oh, yes. We're going to do this in about a sequence of 3. Is that one? Okay, one. No, in 3. I'll take 3 questions in one go. Oh, she wants to do one by one. Please.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Bernadine, for your writing. I'm one of those people that when you won the Booker Prize, I bought all your backlist. And one of the things I noticed in your writing is the hard work. This is the first time I've heard you speak about the hard work. But when we read the books, we get that. We know that somebody has done a lot of work for this. My question is about reclaiming truth. I review books, but I don't like to write negative reviews. If I love a book, everybody will know about it. I know hundreds of people that I've told about Mr. Loverman. If I don't like a book, I write a review, but I don't post it anywhere. So my question to you as an author, because I know that you're an author, you teach people and you give them criticism. Do you think reviewers should give criticism, 1? And then 2, do you think they should do it publicly or privately?
The critical culture is really important, right? But who gets to write these reviews is also really important. And, we do have more black writers writing reviews now than we did years ago. So it's like the gaze, the perspective on the black work has tended to be very white. But critical culture in itself is it's essential, not just in the media, but also in academia. I was studied in academia long before the media was really paying attention to me, because it is the serious study and informed study of our creativity. And all of it shapes the culture that we're in today. I also really do value bookstagrammers, Instagrammers, who are being taken increasingly seriously by the industry. They weren't at the beginning, right? But actually, they're a bridge between the work and the audience. And they will reach huge audiences sometimes that the publishers can't reach. So, for example, many years ago, maybe even today, publishers didn't know how to market to a black audience. They would even say, I hate to say it, black British people don't read books, which is rubbish, right? But they would say that. They can't say that now. They will put on special events for people who are on social media who are promoting books, because they know that you will reach those audiences that they won't reach for reasons we could talk about another day, right? Because they don't have an in to the cultures and the societies and the communities in Britain. So critical culture is really important, and it should be honest. It should be honest, in a sense that it can't just be flattering, sycophantic, obsequious, and serious journalism. It should never be that, right? So it should be honest, but maybe there's an argument for kindness. Maybe there's an argument for balance. And then you take it all with a pinch of salt, right? But it should exist.
Kindness and balance. Great combination. Let's take your question, please, at the back. Please keep your questions brief so that we can have an opportunity to fill more in.
Yes, sure. Good morning,
I
Bernardine.
see the poet dummy. We're coming to you. Go
Okay.
on, please.
Hello, hi, Bernardine. My name is Catherine, and I absolutely loved reading Girl, Woman, Other. It changed my life. I feel like the book opened my eyes to diverse realities of being a girl, a woman, or other, You mentioned that you had to market your book yourself, and that's why I summoned the courage to ask this question. I have social anxiety, so I'm shaking a bit, but I'm fine. I have observed that authors are often burdened with the responsibility of marketing their books themselves. Even you had to market your book yourself, right? And because if they don't, it's hardly going to get done. And now we're here speaking on the theme, reclaiming truth, and specifically our truth. And honestly, we're trying. The Instagrammers are trying, the book talkers are trying, book influencers are trying, but the publishers are also trying, but there's still work to be done. We have tech marketing, we have real estate marketing, but there's hardly a field for book marketing. And that's why I'm building my brand, Anytime, to start the process of building a book marketing industry to help the authors and bridge that gap. So I want to ask, how viable do you think a venture like this would be? Do you think that I'm wasting my time, or do you think it's something that we need?
Sorry, I didn't fully understand everything you said. So, what are you doing exactly?
I'm building a book marketing agency to help authors market their books.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
No, I think, is this on? Yeah, I think that's a great initiative. It's wonderful. And just a little possible correction: publishers do market books, but it's how much they market books. Okay, now it's on. So if you if you're given a big advance, the publisher will work very hard to make sure everybody knows that book is there. If you're given a small advance, the book may be overlooked. But every book is marketed usually, but it's the degree of marketing. I think a book marketing agency is a fantastic idea. It's wonderful. It's inspired. Yeah.
We look forward to seeing your agency grow. Yes, we shall report back next year at Ake. Summary, please.
Okay, so I just want to say thank you to Bernadine because 6 years ago, she judged the prize and my book was a finalist. And when I was trying to change my visa from the Suffered visa to the Global Talent visa, it made the difference that changed my life. So thank you for that. The other thing is, I am 11 years ago, I published my first collection of poetry. I've been writing since 2008, seriously. I have now fought with all my friends that we started together, and I feel like I struggle because it's hard to be a writer, and now all of the support system I had, I no longer talk to them. What's your advice for me? How do I deal with this?
Can you? That's a great question. Can you say why you fell out with them, though?
Oh, the plot thickens.
I'm a psychiatrist. I don't want to cry here today, but I would say a lot of the friendships felt like it was more than literature, but in retrospect, it looks like we were even in competition with each other, as it were. And it's very dark. I don't want to go into it, but how do I continue to write and get the support I need in my process now that I feel a lot like I don't have those guys anymore in my life?
Yeah, I mean, don't forget there are a lot of people and a lot of writers in the world, right? 14 is a very small number or so. So, but I understand exactly where you're coming from. I have similar experiences, especially since I won the Booker. It's like suddenly I'm a target from people, which didn't happen before. But first of all, give, support other writers, make connections, go to their events, especially as a poet. Poets are always out there doing gigs and so on. Make those connections, be the person who offers friendship, and you will find your people. There are lots of great people out there. The ones who are toxic and negative and jealous and resentful, you don't want anything to do with them. You just don't want them in your life because they will drag you down. And there are many people, and sometimes those people emerge when you become, you have a degree of success. But there are lots of people there. There is a big community. There is a community here even. And of course, communities can also be online. So don't cut yourself off because you've had this negative experience. Reach out. Especially you're in the UK, aren't you? Oh my God, the poets love each other. I know they have fallings out and the rest of it, but they are a really tight community and they will support each other. Become part of that community. And just find your way into it. You'll find that people will respond. If you're generous, they will respond back. And especially on social media where you can share other people's books, say nice things about other people's books, they will appreciate that.
We'll take the next question. You've had your hand up for a while, please. Yes.
Good morning. Good morning, Bernardine. It actually feels good to directly interact with you. After about 6 years of mentioning your name as a sort of trophy parade as one of writers of Nigerian origin who have won the Booker. And there is a question I want to ask you. Reading from your book on how your dad calls you Mobology transported me to Nikki May's This Motherless Land, where her protagonist, is Funke Oyenuga in Nigeria and Kate Stones in the UK. With that, she was interrogating the politics of integration and acceptance into the society. So I want to ask, does this particular politics of integration and acceptance plays a role in you settling for Bernadine Evaristo instead of Mobology Evaristo? Thank you.
Yeah. That's a great question. You know, I was born in '59, and my parents wanted all their kids to have English names because it would have been too difficult if we'd have had Yoruba names. But we all have a Yoruba middle name, including Charlie over there, who is Oladimeji.
Ladimedu. Lola, that is not a Q&A question. But I'll allow it.
So they wanted us to have it, English names, but we always had a middle Yoruba name, as have every generation since had that middle name. But my name is foreign. I mean, Bernardine isn't an English name. I think it's originally French. Evaristo is from Portugal, Brazil. Then it went to Nigeria. So it was a foreign name, but it wasn't an African foreign name. And I think, yes, if I'd have had a full, say, Yoruba name growing up in the UK, I think it would have affected how I was treated. Just like even just going for jobs. It would have identified me in a way that the English name or Portuguese, whatever, the European name doesn't identify me. And that was a deliberate decision on my parents' side. And if you read, on my parents' part, if you read Girl, Woman, Other, and you read Carol, her parents, and Carol is somebody in her 30s, her Nigerian parents made the same decision to call her Carol Williams because they didn't want her to face the same issue. What I find very interesting is that people have now claimed African middle names, which I think it probably started with Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. And so people have now put African middle names into their regular name in a way that they didn't before. Because it's a different time, it's a different culture, and we're living in a global world. There are many more people in Africa than there are in Britain. You know, Africa has, 1.1 billion, is it? Britain, we have something like 70 million. You know, so it's decentering what will work in Britain as opposed to what will work globally. Does that answer your question? Yeah.
I think we can take two more questions. So we can take one more question and conclude. You've had your hand up for a while. Please go. Let's make it brief, please.
Thank you, Bernardine. My name is Edem. I'm from Ghana. There's a part of your book where you talked about a point where you were essentially going through questioning some of your decisions, as it were, in relation to conventional ideas around mortgage, lifelong partner, children, right? And then you still had to sit down and look at, especially on children, and your decision to be child-free and say, no, this in reality would not work for me. Now, my question is, throughout your life, how have you gone through phases where you had to sit with yourself? And I don't mean from external pressure. You know, you just sit and look back on your life. And have you stuck to the decisions you've made that have been unconventional?
I think I do. Because I think everything has led me to this point. You know, so all the decisions that I made, which was to live very cheaply, therefore not earning much money for most of my life, has led me to the point where I wrote all those books, which led to the Booker and beyond. So the decisions, I might have questioned them, like I do in the book a little bit. I might question them at certain points, but not to the point where I decided to choose a more conventional route. I never chose the conventional route. I didn't grow up in a conventional family either. You know, it was a mixed family at a time when it was very rare. My mother was very unusual. My father was very unusual. We were allowed to be ourselves, you know, to a certain extent. I mean, he was also very authoritarian, but we could still have our own personalities and pursue the careers that we wanted for ourselves. There was no pressure to become a certain kind of, to join a certain kind of profession or anything. If that had been the case, I would have rebelled. But there would have been a pressure to be a doctor, a lawyer, an accountant, or whatever. But that was never there in my childhood. And so throughout the whole of my life, I've made my own decisions. Married 20 years, I still make my own decisions. You know, I don't... Yeah, apart from the period in my 80s, in my 20s, when I was in a toxic relationship and somebody really dominated me. Apart from that period, which I also don't regret, right? Because it was such a learning curve. Apart from that, I have been fully independent. So, yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for that question and thank you for that answer, Bernardine. I think we're being allowed one last question because Olufemi is making threatening gestures at us. At me, rather.
Not at all, Angela. Yeah, thank you very much, Bernadine. My question arises from your reading and also your conversation with Angela about your trajectory. And it reminded me a lot of Hanif Qureshi's, his path. You know, you and him have both had a very eclectic career, I would say. How do you feel about that comparison? It really struck me quite strongly as you were reading that that the two of you are probably, about the same age roughly, and the two of you both have immigrant backgrounds in the UK, and you've been able to forge these paths that definitely blend your immigrant background with a very strong British sensibility.
Yes, so Hanif Qureshi is about my age. He broke through, I think, in the 80s. So that's a big difference, because he was writing The Buddha of Suburbia. Was that published in the 1980s? It was a huge hit. He was writing for a film. He was writing for theatre. He did grow up not too far from where I grew up. He comes from a dual heritage family. A comparison between the way in which we've approached our writing might be quite interesting, but I think our trajectories have been so different, because he became very famous, I think, very young.
Thank you. Thank you, Bernardine, for your time. Thank you for your magic. Manifesto is available for signing. Should be signing copies right after this session, so do join us at the bookshop. Have a wonderful rest of the day, and thank you for joining us this morning for our first session.
Please give Angela and Bernadine a big round of applause.